All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to my channel. I'm coming at you once again from my son's room because we're in the midst of winter and it's really cold on my porch and I don't feel like sitting out there. As you can see, he's changed the theme. We no longer have Thomas the Tank Engine pictures. Everything has become Super Mario. We've got Mario figurines on the top shelf. And there's a mess of toys all over the floor in here. It looks like some cars. I see Mater sitting in the background on the floor right there. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche's The Joyful Science, or The Gay Science. I've already covered a couple of his works beforehand, so we will be finishing it out here, all right, with this. But this is the third book in what is called the Spirit Trilogy, which began with Human All Too Human, which I've already discussed, and The Dawn of Day, also known as Daybreak. And this was a transitional work. He had just broken with Richard Wagner and had gone like kind of solo as a philosopher. It's written in the aphoristic form, these short like little paragraph long statements, these aphorisms. He continues it here in Daybreak, and he uses the aphorism in The Gay Science. Now this is the Penguin Classics edition. That's what I read. And I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts of this, okay, and talk about everything in it. I'm just going to hit on some of the keys that I've been looking for in the development of Nietzsche's philosophy. I am a lay person, okay? I'm not somebody that's a scholar. I'm just your average Joe, you know. I am a college dropout, and I'm just trying to, you know, learn something at this stage of my life to acquire some of the knowledge that I didn't get through the course of my life as far as education is concerned. So let's get into this. All right, so I started taking extensive notes on this. In fact, I think I left my notebook downstairs, so I'm going to have to put this on pause. All right, so as you can see, I had a composition book that I was going through and trying to write down the aphorisms and kind of summarize or interpret them one by one, which was taking forever. And I think I gave up right around, I wrote it, aphorism 191. I wrote, I give up. Like, I flamed out. I couldn't do it anymore. Or I was never going to finish this book because I've been working on this for a long time and I just wanted to finish it. So one of the things you'll notice if you read any Nietzsche, at least from these particular books that I've discussed here, they're not laid out systematically. Nietzsche will go from idea to idea. He'll have an idea, he'll drop it, maybe he'll come back to it, maybe he won't. And it can be a little bit confusing. He often contradicts himself, which is a little bit maddening because he'll say things that are completely opposed to one another, sometimes within paragraphs, you know, like this paragraph to this paragraph. So you're just like, what in the world? He makes a lot of statements or claims that he doesn't even try to back up. So he's really following that the tradition of the sophist. I don't think that his philosophy is so much engaged as trying to, you know, establish some sort of formal philosophy as it is to question everything and to cause us to ask questions and ideas. That doesn't mean he's tearing everything down. What it means is that he's trying to get down to like the brass tacks, so to speak, of the foundations of, really the big one is morality. His attack and his assault on the moral ethos of society. And his rejection of metaphysics, which I've already discussed. I'm not going to go back and go over all that again, okay? Because I've already talked about his assault on metaphysics when I discussed Human All Too Human and Dawn of Day. So after all this tearing down, what do you do? Well, he finally comes up with in the Joyous Science or the Gay Science here, what is the purpose of life if you destroy and tear down all the foundations of religion, morality, and everything else? And he answers that in aphorism number 1, which I won't read the whole aphorism, but I'll read perhaps part of it. He says here, this is the preface. I want the actual, you see there's poetry in here as well. So this is a little bit more of the gay science, I guess some explanation needs to be given. He's really like referring to kind of like the troubadour or the wandering minstrel poet type person. That's what he means. That's what he's getting at. That's why this work has kind of a different tone than the other two that I read. It's got like a lot of song and stuff in it. But here he says the purpose of life. So the purpose of life, if you've undermined all of the foundations of, here, then what do you build? And he says this, excuse me, whether I look upon men with a good or evil eye, I always find them engaged in but one task, each and every one of them, the preservation of the human race. And certainly not from any great love for it, but simply because nothing in them is older, stronger, more inexorable, or invincible than that instinct. Because this instinct is precisely the nature of our species and herd. And he goes on to talk about this. So that's it in a nutshell. The preservation of the species. But it's to go beyond simply preserving. Okay? It's not just preserving the species. It is becoming more. And that's really his critique of Darwin. So he had critiqued Darwinism in All Too Human and Daybreak, even though he believes in Darwinism, at least the theory of Darwin and evolution is concerned, but he, at the same time, was critical. And I think I wrote down a note here where we can find his exact reason for his rejection of Darwin's, I guess, survival of the fittest. Is that what you call it? Just merely the preservation of the species. And he speaks of this in aphorism 349, where he says this. Excuse me. This aphorism is titled More on the Origin of the Scholars. He says, wishing only to preserve oneself is the expression of distress, of a restriction on the proper fundamental impulse of life, which aims at the extension of power. And with this intention, often enough calls into question and sacrifices self-preservation. So, and here he does speak about Darwinism, and he calls it crude, calls Darwinism crude. He says, furthermore, towards the end of this, right, that I've highlighted, the struggle for existence is but an exception, a temporary restriction on the life will. The struggle, whether great or small, everywhere turns on predominance, on growth and expansion, on power, in accordance with the will to power, which is precisely the will to life. So he didn't talk a whole lot about will to power in these two works, and we get like the first inklings of will to power in the Gay Science here. So I wanted to hit on that, some of these themes that pop up. In aphorism 108, we get the famous statement of Nietzsche, God is dead. Okay? And that is in book number 3. And I'll try to read the exact context or what he actually says here. So he says here, 108, after the Buddha died, people showed his shadow for centuries afterwards in a cave. A monstrous and unearthly shadow. God is dead. But given the ways of men, perhaps for a millennia to come, there will be caves in which his shadow will be shown, and we still have to subdue his shadow. So what is the shadow of morality? The shadow of God, for Nietzsche, is morality. It's morals. So he has no... And he does make this explicitly clear later on. I don't know if I wrote it down. I think it's in the section where he talks about faith and science. And I'll maybe get to that real quick. No, it's actually in aphorism 343. Okay, this is where he gives a further breakdown on what that shadow of God is. He says, the greatest event of recent times, the fact that God is dead, that, and this is what he means by God is dead. He's going to define it here. Quote, the belief in the Christian God has become untenable. And he says it's already begun to cast its first shadows over Europe. So the shadow of God for Nietzsche is Christian morality, Christian moral, the Christian ethic. And in aphorism 344, okay, he's going to say that science, basically science is the new religion. Faith and science is the new religion. He talks about kind of these underpinning convictions of, we'll see what it says here. It is said with good reason that convictions have no civil rights in science. It is only when they are willing to reduce themselves to the humble status of a hypothesis, of a preliminary experimental standpoint, of a regulative fiction, that they may be allowed to enter the domain of knowledge and even be accorded a certain value within it, though with the proviso that they must be kept under constant surveillance, under the surveillance of our distrust. But does that not imply that, strictly speaking, a conviction may gain admission to science only when it ceases to be a conviction? Does not the discipline of the scientific spirit only begin when we are no longer allowed any convictions? Very probably, but it remains to be seen whether there does not have to be some sort of conviction present in the first place in order for this discipline to begin. A conviction so imperative and unconditional that it makes us sacrifice all our other convictions. Here's what he says. We see that even science rests upon faith, that there is no presuppositionalist science. Okay? I found this a very refreshing claim that there's no such things as having no presups when it comes to science, scientific theory. All right? So, and he'll go on to critique science, saying that later on in the same aphorism, in aphorism 344, he'll say, it is still a metaphysical faith on which our faith in science rests. So for him, what's really happened is that man has transferred his faith in the Christian God to faith in science. But faith in God is presuppositional. In other words, we just believe that God exists. However, if you're going to break everything down to like empirical data collection, as Nietzsche is saying, looking at the material world here, and he's not just a materialist, he does believe in like a spiritual aspect of man, but he doesn't focus all of his attention on metaphysics. You know, he's rejecting Platonism, he's rejecting Eastern mysticism, he's rejecting Christianity, that whole ethos. But what you're looking at with science is, for instance, let's take the statement or the belief of empiricism. This is sense data, right? Collecting data through the five senses, what we see, taste, touch, smell, hear, okay? And you could make a statement like an empiricist would say, for instance, that the only thing that we can believe is true is that which we can gather through empiricism, right? Only empirical data is true. The statement itself, only empirical data is true, cannot be proven empirically. In other words, you can't measure the statement of whether empirical data alone is true or not by measuring it. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. It's something that's not itself empirical, therefore it's metaphysical, right? It transcends the physical realm. It's an idea. It resides in the realm of thought. You can't prove the statement empirically. So it's a presupposition, which makes it a matter of faith. That's what Nietzsche gets at. And I find it refreshing that Nietzsche says it, because so many of the new atheists that we have today, people like Dawkins and Hitchens and stuff, they would never agree to that statement. They'll run around it. They just, say that, that religion's false, period. And that we have to believe in science. And they don't really have a justification for it. It just is. It's presuppositional. But you'll never hear them like admit it. Nietzsche does. Okay, and that's why I find it refreshing. This is why this is a guy that I really like to read, because I think he's a lot more honest than a lot of the navel gazers that are walking around today. All right, so what else we got here? I just want to hit on a few more of the key points. So we get God is dead in 108, aphorism 108. He rejects pantheism, the idea that everything is God, in aphorism 109. He brings up the idea of the amor fati, the love of fate, in aphorism 276. These are all ideas that Nietzsche is going to have throughout the rest of his works. And then we have the idea of the eternal recurrence, which appears first in aphorism 285 and then again in aphorism 341. Now, I know eternal recurrence is going to play a big part in his next work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So I'll probably have more to say on that when I get to this, maybe go into it a little bit more in depth. But I did talk about eternal recurrence and amor fati when I reviewed this book, Dune and Philosophy. So if you want to hear me really break down amor fati, the love of fate, and talk about eternal recurrence, I would suggest watching the review I did for Dune and Philosophy, because I'm not going to go into it here. There's no point in me rediscussing something I've already talked about. So I think the final thing that I'll go into here is, let's see, the first mention of Zarathustra, who's going to be the central figure of this work, is mentioned in the Joyful Science. I have it jotted down here as aphorism 342. So, let's see. Incepit tragedia. This is right after the greatest way. So, eternal recurrence is aphorism 341. First mention of Zarathustra is in 342. All right? And I'm not really going to go into that. He's talking about Zarathustra coming down. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home in Lake Urmi and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and his solitude, and for 10 years did not tire of them, but in the end his heart changed, and one morning he arose with the dawn, and facing the sun spoke it thus: "O you great star, what happiness would you enjoy without those for whom you shine? For 10 years you have come up to my cave, and you would have grown weary of your light and of this path, were it not for me, my eagle and my serpent. But we await you every morning, received your abundance, and blessed you for it. Behold, I grow weary of my wisdom. Like the bee that has gathered too much honey, I need hands outstretched to receive it. I should like to dispense and distribute it until the wise again rejoice in their folly, and the poor in their riches. To that end I must descend into the depths, as you do in the evening when you go behind the sea in bright light, even unto the underworld. You superabundant star, like you I must go down, as the people to whom I will descend call it. Bless me then, O you calm eye, who can behold even an excess of happiness without envy. Bless the cup which wants to run over, so that the water may flow golden out of it, and carry everywhere the reflection of your bliss. Behold, this cup wants to be empty again, and Zarathustra wants to be a man again. And with that, Zarathustra began to go down." So, as you can see, a lot of this stuff is like, what is he talking about? And you kind of have to interpret it, and that's what I was trying to do with my notebook here, but I threw my hands up in the air and said, you know what, I'm just going to finish reading this and pick out the stuff I can understand, and the other stuff, maybe I'll come back to it later, but I probably understood about maybe a third of what I read, if I'm being honest. I really need a Nietzsche scholar to interpret this for me, and I don't even know if all of Nietzsche can be interpreted. So it's really these major themes. Nietzsche's rejection of metaphysics. Nietzsche believes in the evolution to breed a Superman, so it's almost like eugenics in a way I don't think he'd be opposed to. So like Khan Noonien Singh in Star Trek, like he's a Nietzschean Superman, right? So the idea of eternal recurrence that I've mentioned here when I talked about Dune, this is something that's, I don't know, kind of weird, but you'll see it in, I think it's in the Wheel of Time, right? Which, who would have thunk? But the Ouroboros Okay, the serpent eating its tail, symbol of eternal occurrence. It's this idea that everything in history is cyclical and happens over and over again exactly the same way. Of course, Christianity rejects this explicitly because if you believe in eternal recurrence, then you would no longer have free will. Free will would be like non-existent. And for Nietzsche, there is no free will. He's mentioned this several times. I propose that maybe this came from his Lutheran background. In fact, he does have some very harsh things to say about Lutheranism in Joyous Science. Maybe I'll read that and then finish up with that as my closing thought, because I really just want to kind of wrap things up here and not drag it out too long. But I'll find that passage on Luther because I thought it was interesting. So here's something interesting while I was looking for that, is that this is in aphorism 357. This is the question of existence. He said this was proposed by Schopenhauer. He calls Schopenhauer, let's see, he calls it the problem of the value of existence. And he says that this scholar was, let's see, the event after which this problem was to be expected was certainly so that the astronomer of the soul could have calculated the day and hour for it, namely the decline of faith in the Christian God, the victory of scientific atheism. He says that this calls into question the value of existence. He calls Schopenhauer the first avowed and unwavering atheist that Germans have had. And then he says here, we can see what actually triumphed over the Christian God, Christian morality itself. An ever stricter conception of truthfulness, the confessional subtlety of the Christian conscience, translated and sublimated to the scientific conscience, to intellectual scrupulousness at all costs. So, it's this Christian conscience which has been transferred over to science. Okay, this is what he says. Sublimated to the scientific conscience, intellectual scrupulousness at all cost. He goes on to say, we reject the Christian interpretation and condemn its meaning as counterfeit. We are immediately confronted in a formidable manner with Schopenhauerian question, does existence have any meaning at all? This is a question which will take a few centuries to be fully understood in all its profundity. So there, this is what Nietzsche is wrestling with. I think this is why people call him a prophet of nihilism. It's not so much that Nietzsche was a nihilist. In fact, he feared nihilism, but he said without Christianity, without this moral ethos that's able to, that people can't believe in it anymore, then all of society is going to crumble. So he's trying to find this answer to it. And in the next chapter, the next aphorism here, 358, he calls it the peasant revolt of the spirit. He says, we Europeans hold an immense world of wreckage in which some things still tower above us. Many others stand deserted and dilapidated, but most things have already fallen into the ground and become overgrown. Of course, he'll go on here. I'm going to just skip some of this. He says, what am I describing? The church. The church in this city in ruins. We behold the religious society of Christendom shaken to its very foundations. Belief in God is overthrown. Belief in the ascetic ideal of Christianity is now in its death throes. Such an old and well-constructed edifice as Christianity, it was the last construction of the Romans. I would contest that, but that's what he says. And he said, could not, of course, be destroyed all at once. All kinds of earthquakes had to shake it. All kinds of spirits with bore did gnaw and molder have had to help. However, what's most remarkable is the fact that those who have been the most anxious to conserve and preserve Christianity are the very ones who did the most to destroy it. I mean the Germans. And he's talking specifically about the Lutheran Reformation. Okay, Martin Luther in 1517 on October 31st nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral in Germany, sparking the Protestant Reformation. And he says here, from top to bottom, the Lutheran Reformation was the simple folks' indignation against something complicated. He calls it an honest mistake. He says that he makes some claims about Luther. He says, quote, Luther was dangerously superficial, short-sighted, and improvident, above all, as a man who came from the common people, and whom everything one inherits from a ruling caste, any instinctive understanding of how to exercise power, was completely absent, so that his work, his determination to restore what the Romans had constructed, involuntarily and unconsciously became nothing but the beginning of a work of destruction. This is an atheist. This is not. This isn't an Eastern Orthodox Christian making this claim here. This is an atheist. This is somebody who was Lutheran, is saying that Luther's Reformation was a work of destruction. He goes on to, in his critique, he says, after Luther had given the priest a wife, he's talking about Roman Catholicism here, right? The Eastern Orthodox Church has always had married priesthood. The priests have always, we've never gotten rid of that. In fact, if you go back into ancient times, the Latin Church had married priests as well. It became a thing later on, a local matter, due to the practice of nepotism, right? That these bishops and stuff would transfer their bishopric to their children because it was the accumulation of this temporal wealth and power. That's why the Latin West outlawed the practice of marriage for the priesthood. Eastern Orthodox still have married priests, but we deny marriage to bishops. Okay, so you can't hold a bishopric if you are married. If you're a widower, you can, if your wife dies, you can become a bishop, but you cannot be a bishop if you have a wife due to the practice of this nepotism, right? So after Luther had given the priest a wife, he had to take from him the confessional, the penance of confession, right? Going to a priest to confess your sins. That was psychologically appropriate, but in so doing, he practically abolished the Christian priest himself. So this is why Protestantism doesn't really have priests, okay? He says the priest's profound usefulness has always consisted in his being a sacred ear, a silent well, and a grave for secrets. Every man his own priest. Behind such formulae and their peasant cunning, there lay concealed in Luther the deepest hatred of superior men, and at the rule of superior men, as the church had conceived them, Luther shattered an ideal which he was unable to attain. So he says, what caused the Protestant Reformation? For Nietzsche, Luther was jealous. He couldn't be one of these powerful men in the church, so he rebelled against it. He owes to he'll say here, quote, Europeans' diminishing sense of hierarchy, or increasing sense of benevolence, if one prefers a moral expression, especially in the North, took a remarkable step forward with the Lutheran Reformation, and likewise there grew out of it a suppleness and restlessness of spirit, a thirst for independence, a belief in the right to freedom, and a certain naturalness, if we are willing to concede to the Reformation the merit of having fostered and prepared the way for what we nowadays revere as, quote, modern science. Modern science. I'm going to skip a big portion here, and he says at the end about church and state, let us not forget what a church ultimately is as opposed to every state. A church is above all a form of domination which secures for the most spiritual men the highest position and believes so much in the power of spirituality as to forbid itself all cruder means of violence. For this reason alone, the church is under all circumstances a nobler institution than the state. So Nietzsche is a man full of contradictions. Like I said, he'll attack the church and at the same time turn around and praise it. He will praise people like Luther and attack them simultaneously. So he's an interesting figure. Okay, but yeah, I guess I'm gonna wrap things up there, and I'll get into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Again, if you want to hear me talk about these other ideas, of Nietzsche that I've already discussed. You can watch my previous reviews for Human All Too Human, for The Dawn of Day. I probably go most in depth on eternal recurrence, like I said, in that Dune and Philosophy when I reviewed this book. But I'm going to head into Thus Spoke Zarathustra and begin reading that and see how Nietzsche's ideas continue to develop, because he's not static. This is a man reading through these the way that I am. You see him like grappling with these ideas and forming his philosophy as he goes along. So, as I said, in Human All Too Human and Daybreak, he was merely asking questions like about things, and here he proposes that the reason for existence is to, the survival of the human species. So, all right, I'm gonna wrap it up. Let me know what you think. Any Nietzsche scholars out there, let me know what you think. I guess that's it. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.